today's EDGE seminar. We are joined today by Elsa Panciroli of the University of Oxford, and she will be talking to us about the exciting research that she's doing on the Isle of Skye. Before I introduce Elsa in a little bit more detail, I just have a couple of housekeeping rules that I want to convey to you all. So first of all, you are in the system that we use here today, you won't have any ability to turn your microphones on or to become visible. You're only going to see the panelists today and the speaker. We do have an opportunity to chat, a chat function that's enabled, and that's the vehicle by which you'll be able to ask questions at the end of the talk. By all means, put chat in as we're going through the talk, but when you're doing that, please make sure and post your question to everybody. You have an option to do that. If you don't post it to everyone, then I won't be able to see your chat and I won't be able to ask Elsa the questions. So please make sure and do that. The second thing that I need to let you know is that we are being recorded today. You will have heard that as we joined. So that's the other thing to remind you of. And after that, I have no more housekeeping to talk about, so I will move on and introduce you to today's speaker. So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome Elsa today. She is an alumna of the University of the Highlands and Islands. She started her undergraduate career here with us many years ago as a BSc student in environmental studies. And as an archaeologist, I'm really pleased to remember that she did some excavation on some of our field schools and worked at the Nessie Brodgar in particular, and I think maybe fostered an interest in bones and maybe took her then into paleontology, which is what she did after graduating from the UHI. So she moved on to do paleontology and did a master's in paleobiology at the University of Bristol, after which she went on to do a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, along with the National Museum of Scotland. Her research interest focuses on the origins and evolution of mammals, and she is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. So that's an excellent progression. So it's very lovely to have you here speaking to us today, and you're going to be talking about the fossil evidence from the Isle of Skye. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you and let you introduce us to Skye, and it's really, really old bones. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's an absolute pleasure. It's so weird being back, coming full circle and getting to speak at a UHI event. Now, just give me one moment to share my screen. Okay. So, I'm assuming that's all gone ahead fine. Without further ado, I'll just get started. Well, as I say, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you today about science on Skye's shoreline. So the theme for this talk comes from what I found a sort of challenging clash between my own beliefs regarding conservation of the natural world and my work as a paleontologist on the Isle of Skye and elsewhere. And I work in what is by nature quite an extractive discipline. As a scientist, the community I belong to is often focused on the very literal scientific value of places and objects and words. And paleontologists, like all natural scientists, they reduce pieces of the natural world into objects to study and to classify. But the landscapes of Scotland in particular, they also hold this much deeper personal meaning for me, as I'm sure they do for all of you, for all of us who find our home there or who enjoy visiting. And fossils themselves, they lie in this sort of Venn diagram of disciplines and interests. They're a science, but also a hobby. People collect them, they're art, they encourage tourism, they're part of natural and cultural heritage, and of course, conservation. So one of the main questions that I want to pose here and that I've been asking myself is, how do we protect active sites of scientific research and incorporate them into the broader geotourism and geoheritage of the area in a way that doesn't compromise that heritage or the scientific activity. And I suppose posed in the other direction, in areas of valuable natural heritage and beauty, how do we as scientists carry out scientific research that doesn't compromise or indeed even adds to or complements the valuable heritage of the area? Now, I should say before I go on that I'm not going to answer those questions for you. This talk is really an exploration of the themes that question raises. It's part of an ongoing process of thinking about paleontology's place in rural Scotland and of course beyond, within a framework of cultural heritage and emerging geotourism initiatives. So I'm going to focus on the sites on Skye in terms of their place in geoheritage and geotourism to encourage discussion on how we might continue to protect them into the future. And I invite everybody here to share their thoughts on the issues that I'm going to raise. So this topic is relevant now more than ever due to the rising interest in Skye as Scotland's dinosaur isle. Now that's a moniker that has a few issues, which I'm going to come back to later in the talk. So although the history of discovery of fossils on Skye goes back to the 1970s, or even further if you count discoveries that remained unstudied for a number of years, the levels of media coverage, which as you can see here varies wildly in terms of accuracy and sensationalism, it has definitely grown in the last decade, especially as fossil discoveries are shared more broadly with the press and on social media. Dinosaur footprints are of particular interest to the public, and Skye receives many visitors who come specifically to walk in the footsteps of these giants. So with increased interest from visitors, we have this growing geotourism opportunity, but we also have conservation concerns. Already we've seen some stories of damage being done, not only to footprint sites, but to other fossil localities on the island. And there is specific legislature in place to give legal protection to the fossil-bearing localities, but damage can still occur, both unintentional and very much intentional. For example, from collectors who may want to nab a prize or something to sell in the open market. So I'm going to talk about the kinds of protection that are already in place in Skye, which include a network of SSSI, so that's sites of special scientific interest, and what they mean. And I want to ask how we balance geotourism and conservation concerns. But I want to talk about things from the perspective of a scientist who works there. What is it like to work on the shore, on the literal edge? In what ways do researchers minimise their environmental impact? And how could we work together with communities to protect these localities and help them benefit from them as heritage and geotourism hotspots? So I think one of the first things I should do is just quickly define what I mean by conservation and preservation. So these terms are not synonymous, although often they are used that way. But conservation, as this quote says, allows ongoing scientific and educational usage of the resource, whereas preservation implies that the resource is completely protected from any further depletion. Thus, the emphasis is placed on the management of a particular feature to retain a particular quality by managing that change, rather than on preservation of the feature with no change at all. Now, I think you'll probably all agree, I hope, that we want to conserve Skye's fossil heritage rather than preserve it. Protection in this sense, or geoconservation, is legal protection as well as physical protection. And we'll come back to the ways in which we can protect sites in order to conserve them later on. Now, I mentioned earlier there's been this rise in geotourism on Skye. So I realise this might be a new term for some listeners. So a definition of geotourism given by Gray is tourism based on an area's geological or geomorphological resources that attempts to minimise impacts of this tourism through geoconservation management. Now, geotourism as a concept was initially aimed to ensure the sustainable development of an area that's of interest specifically to the scientific community. But over the years, it's been expanded, and it links geological heritage with tourism, and particularly in rural areas. And geotourism is far from new, of course, particularly in Scotland. most of you will be familiar with the rise of tourism in Scotland in the Victorian period, much of it fueled by a romanticism of the Highlands and Islands landscape in particular, driven by things like the novels of Sir Walter Scott. And here, for example, is a view of Loch Nagar by James Giles, which captures this idealised landscape, increasingly, of course, forcibly emptied of people. Now, tourism driven by such landscapes, it gives rise to efforts to preserve, and note that I say preserve rather than conserve in this case, the features that attracted people there in the first place. And therefore it changes our relationship. It changes the relationship between people and the landscape, from one of utility through agriculture and industry to a more emotional and spiritual enrichment. And an individual's feelings about that change are usually influenced by whether they're visitor or whether they are part of the local community, who in the time period this was painted, for example, were being systematically deprived of their traditional agricultural lands. Now, one of the oldest examples of geotourism, just to give some historical context, and of geoconservation actually comes from Germany. And you might be surprised to hear that it was in the 1600s. By 1668, guided tours were being given of a show cave, which I think is a fantastic term, called Panciroli. And this has been visited by thousands, millions of people ever since. And you can see in this image on the left-hand side, these early geotourists climbing among the stalagmites by torchlight. Now, Panciroli was scientifically investigated in the 1650s, and access was controlled to protect it in 1668. So that makes it the earliest example of a conservation measure that was taken at a specific geological site. Now, following on from this, the first nationwide protective measures weren't instituted until 150 years later in the early 1800s. So let's look at an example of one of those in Scotland. One of the oldest geoconservation, geoheritage sites is the Fossil Grove in Glasgow, which I'm sure many of you have visited. Now, this is the site of multiple fossilised lepidodendron tree stumps dating to the Carboniferous around 325 million years ago. Now, Fossil Grove was discovered in 1887 and a building was placed over it in 1890 to protect it and allow people to access and view the fossils. And this has been in existence in one form or another ever since. Although recently it has been closed and is in need of conservation. And if you'd like to know more about this, there's actually a really excellent online lecture given by David Webster as part of the Scottish Geology Trust's Geology Festival last year, and I highly recommend having a look for that on YouTube if you'd like to know more. So thinking about this, Eric Stad noted in his History of Geoconservation in Europe that early conservation efforts often concentrated on peculiar objects standing out as features of the landscape and often with mythical associations. Now, I pulled this out because I find it especially interesting as it relates to Skye, because I believe that dinosaurs really fit into a modern mythology about the past and about science and about paleontology. For many people, they are more creatures of myth than of reality. They sit on this boundary between the real and the imagined, which is why their fossils garner so much more interest than those of other extinct animals. So the first list of geological sites needing protection in the UK as a whole wasn't published then until 1945, which is really quite recently, given this much longer history of geotourism and geoconservation that I've just outlined. And I should also mention national parks. The concept of a national park, meanwhile, this originated in the USA around about the same time, the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Now, national parks take a more holistic approach to conservation that incorporates natural heritage, most often ecological and biological, I would say, along with geological and cultural heritage aspects. And this is an image of Yellowstone National Park, which is probably the most famous national park in the global north. Now, in terms of the context of the erection of national parks in North America, it should be noted that well-intentioned desires to preserve landscapes can at times conflict with the needs and cultures of the people who live there. So here I'd like to start talking about extraction and geology. So paleontology, it's often seen as a discipline of preservation, but it's in equal measure destructive. And this is true historically. too. Like many sciences, paleontology has quite a strong legacy of colonialism. Now, in the Victorian era, paleontology was often folded into a broader geological exploration of the world, particularly the so-called New World and remote parts of the world. And of course, those terms reflect the viewpoint that Europe was central and that all other places were at its edge, secondary or peripheral to it and its history and knowledge. And this outlook applied on small scales as well as global ones. So for example, the perceived remoteness of the Highlands and Islands, which is a perception that still persists to the present day. Now, Europeans became especially interested in geological mapping in the 1800s, and the process of mapping was a form of claiming ownership and dominion, as well as understanding Earth's processes. As Stafford said of the geological surveys being carried out during the British expansion of the mid-1800s, geological maps spread scientific order over the Earth's surface. The emphasis on mapping gave geology a strong territorial dimension. Rocks, fossils, maps, and memoirs, they flowed in from the periphery. And the same men who sent fossils to the Museum of Practical Geology also sent seeds to Kew Gardens, archaeological loot to the British Museum, and accounts of exploration to the Royal Geographical Society. So in this context, I consciously chose the map of the Scottish Highlands in the background as the one produced by Roderick Impey Murchison. Murchison was a Scottish geologist born in the Muir of Ord, although brought up elsewhere, and he's rightly heralded for his incredible contributions to geology. But he was also very much a militaristic imperialist, and he combined geological surveying with intelligence gathering and establishing European ideas about order and civility on the indigenous peoples of the areas being mapped. Now, 19th century geologists like Murchison used local knowledge in the colonies to find and extract fossils as well as mineral wealth, and in those countries that were self-governing, the expertise required to carry out geological surveys and to recognise resources, including paleontological ones, it often still had to be sourced from Europe. So they often had to rely on Europeans to enter their borders and to carry out geological survey work, which placed people into a position of dependency and perpetuated the power imbalance between nations. Now, in the same period as this colonial expansion was taking place elsewhere, geology was in its infancy. Scotland was providing evidence for how geological processes worked, but the majority of geologists who mapped and studied the Highlands, and here are 3 of them along the bottom of the screen there, they were not indigenous to the area. The majority of Highlands and Islands Gaelic-speaking Scots, who were on the whole too poor to pursue things like geology, they were of course being systematically cleared from these areas that they were mapping and studying. So this is what makes the occasional exception, for example, the Highland writer and stonemason Hugh Miller, pictured here on the right, so compelling. He was a self-taught geologist, and his interpretations of landscape, science, and geology they're fascinating for many reasons. But in the context of this talk, they're of interest for the unique voice that he held in scientific discourse. Miller was a popularizer of geology and paleontology to the public, thanks to his vivid descriptions in passages like those in The Cruise of the Betsy. And his narrative voice was undoubtedly shaped by being from within the culture and community of the landscapes he described. So his interpretations were influenced by quite a different background than most of his geologizing contemporaries. Now, Miller's example is of interest when we're talking about the modern role of local stakeholders in shaping the discourse and direction of geoconservation initiatives today. And this is the historical context through which we should be viewing scientific and geoconservation practice in the Highlands and Islands and beyond, because these patterns do echo into the present day. You know, universities and geological groups from around the world travel to the Highlands to learn about geology, and it is no wonder. I mean, we have some of the most incredible landscapes in Europe. They provide foundational examples of geological concepts that can be used in teaching as well as, of course, drawing in tourists, geological or otherwise. In Scotland itself, however, geology is no longer taught in our schools, and local communities are seldom included in the work that's being carried out in their area, at least certainly not as much as. Now, this is of interest here because of how it potentially influences attitudes towards the use and conservation of resources and landscapes in the Highlands and Islands. And it's of interest when we consider how scientific work in the Highlands and Islands intersects with local heritage initiatives and the concerns and needs of local stakeholders. In terms of the literal physical impact on the landscape, as I said, paleontology is of course a form of extraction. And in many countries, fossils are classed along with minerals as a resource, and they're legislated for as such. There's an intimate tie between the discoveries that have been made through time and mineral resource extraction. Most of the early fossil discoveries made by Europeans, they came about during mining and quarry work. And this includes the first scientifically described dinosaur and mammal fossils from Oxfordshire. But it also includes the first fossil footprints, however, and they were found in the Scottish quarries of Corncockle and Locher Briggs near Dumfries in the 1800s. And then shortly after, the similar discoveries were made in Elgin as well. Many of the Glasgow and Edinburgh tenements were built of Corncockle sandstone, as were more recent buildings like Buchanan Street Shopping Centre. And in the process of extracting building blocks in the 1800s, workers exposed bedding planes, which had been walked over by ancient reptiles and mammal ancestors long before the time of dinosaurs. And I bring this up because these discoveries actually stand in contrast to what's taking place on Skye now. Skye's vertebrate fossils weren't found thanks to industry, but through targeted searching or, in some cases, serendipity. So the first vertebrate fossils on Skye are mentioned in geological surveys made by Benjamin Peach at the turn of the 20th century. And in his survey in 1910, he noted, when talking about the Jurassic rocks on the Peninsula, from some of the lower beds of the foregoing section, chelonian and other reptilian bones, fish scales and teeth were obtained. And chelonian just means turtle bones. Now it was this single sentence that sent the paleontologist Dr. Michael Waldman, who's pictured here with me, searching the shoreline in Stratheard in 1971. And Mike was a school teacher by that point, and he was guiding Duke of Edinburgh students up to Camasunary at the foot of the Coolin. Now, based on Peach's mention, he decided to detour and prospect for fossils, and he ended up discovering the first Jurassic age fossil mammals in Scotland. So this is an extremely significant scientific discovery. The larger photo here was taken by Waldman of his friend and colleague Robert Savage, and the two of them basically kicked off sort of scientific fieldwork on the island. But since then, lots of new discoveries have been made, many more isolated discoveries around the island, but especially in the north and the Trotternish Peninsula, which is now most famous for its dinosaur footprints. And the first published dinosaur discovery was not until 1992, so still quite recently, well, depending on your perception of time. And since that time, vertebrate fossil finds have continued to occur regularly, and that includes more footprints and bones, as well as the bones of mammals, crocodiles, small reptiles, pterosaurs and marine reptiles. And many of these are treated in this excellent book on the right-hand side there, which I highly recommend for anyone who'd like to know more about the history of discovery on the island. So all of these discoveries have led to the designated legal protection of the main fossil-bearing localities on Skye, and latterly to the island being known by some as Scotland's Dinosaur Isle. Now, this is a name given after England's well-known dinosaur isle, the Isle of Wight. And this is in itself an interesting choice of moniker, given the discussion earlier about viewpoints that place certain parts of Europe as first or central and other locations as secondary or peripheral or on the edge. Now, before I continue, I want to give a short geological background to the Isle of Skye. So this geology not only explains why so much paleontological and geological fieldwork focuses on this island in particular, but also the ways in which our fieldwork on the island is constrained by the natural world, and it pushes us to the literal edge of the landscape. So the island of Skye is most famous for what is, in geological terms, quite recently deposited rock. Now, I use the word recently in a deep time sense, employed by geologists who see time in the context of a 4.6 billion year lifespan of our planet. So in this slide, we're looking at rocks that were laid down relatively recently, only 55 million years ago. And at that time, the western edge of Scotland was pulling away from the eastern edge of North America, opening up the Atlantic Ocean, a process that continues to this day. And a series of volcanoes erupted along this boundary, coating the landscape in multiple lava flows over the course of millions of years. Similar flood basalts can be seen today on Iceland, which, like Scotland 55 million years ago, sits on the edge of this tectonic boundary. Now, the landscape around the Old Man of Storr and the Quiraing in Skye is formed from these multiple eruptions, each one laying down another blanket of lava. And if you look closely at this image, you should be able to see the horizontal lines through the cliff face, each one marking another separate lava flow. In fact, the Coolin mountain range, as well as the mountains of Rum and the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, to name a few locations, those are actually the hardened guts of these volcanoes. And the lava they spewed, which is called flood basalt, it coated much older rocks underneath it, including sediments that were laid down in the middle of the Jurassic. Now, those are the rock layers that yield the vertebrate fossils. But of course, as I say, these Jurassic sediments are almost entirely covered and inaccessible, except for on the shoreline. Here, the blanket of lava, it pushes paleontologists like myself to the periphery, forcing us to search where the edges of the island meet the edge of the sea. And because of this, our field season has to tie in to cycles of the natural world, namely of the sea itself. So our seas, of course, have a natural tide cycle. There are 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day. And because we search for our fossils on the very edges of the shore, we have to time field work to provide the maximum exposure of rocks. We hunt from a few hours before the lowest to a few hours after the lowest tide. And outside of those times, there's not all that much point in being there. So in this transitional space, water erosion removes the younger flood basalts and it exposes the older Jurassic rocks, revealing the fossils as well as, of course, kelp beds and sponges and crabs. But as the water exposes the fossils, it also damages them, and eventually it destroys them. And this is true at coastal fossil-bearing sites everywhere. The sea is both a friend and a hungry enemy. So by finding and collecting the specimens on the shore, we are preserving what would, or conserving what would otherwise be erased by the continual eating of the water's edge. So let's talk a bit about protection. There are there are multiple scientific teams that work on the Isle of Skye, but all of us have to seek permission to prospect and extract fossils from Scottish Natural Heritage, which of course is now NatureScot, and the landowners. And this is because there are various legal protections in place on the island. So I'm going to focus here on the Strathaird Peninsula because that's where I mainly work, and discussion is going to centre on the consideration of fossils. And that's partly because fossils are my area of interest, but also because they face unique conservation threats compared to geology more generally or wildlife. And this, of course, includes the unique risk of being collected for profit or damaged by amateur collectors. So Skye is protected by several SSSIs, and those are Sites of Special Scientific Interest, and they're designated by NatureScot under the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004. They're shown here in this map in red cross hatching. And SSSIs are areas of land and water that are considered representative of our natural heritage. And this can be in terms of their flora and their fauna, their geology or the geomorphology, and most often actually a mixture of these things. And in Scotland as a whole, about 12.5% of our land has SSSI status, which amounts to around about, in fact, I think over 1 million hectares. So designated areas of landowners, including individuals, organisations, but the designation of who owns land. Now, looking more clearly at the Strathaird Peninsula, you can in the middle between the 66.5 hectares. It's desert protection because of its strategic to it being the units. So that means section is representative of an entire layer to which they belong. It's similar to a type specimen in a zoological collection. Now, Stratheard also has the most extensive and informative exposures of many key rock layers in the Hebrides. Now, in terms of the fossils found there, it is specifically protected because of the fossil mammals from the Mesozoic, and that's the time period that includes the Jurassic, as first found by Michael Waldman in 1971, and these are the fossils that I also specialise in. Now, as well as this, it's noted as a ground for golden eagles, which is why part of it also falls into the Culin Special Protection Area, and I've just added that to the map there in purple vertical stripes. So the Culin mountain range has one of the densest populations of golden eagles in the UK. But this part of the Stratheard coast is also a geological conservation review site, so that's shown in pale aqua blue, which I've just added to the map. And offshore, heading towards the Isles of Rum and Egg, it's a site of marine interest and a marine protected area for its kelp forests, which support these populations of sea urchins and cold water corals and sea cucumbers and burrowing anemones. For botanists among you, there is a globally scarce liverwort called Legunia mandonii, and it's also recorded as being present on the peninsula, although it's not in the SSSI itself. And to top everything else off, the area is, of course, a national scenic area. And I think that really doesn't require any explanation. So you can see that this area has lots of different legal protections in place, and they're all aimed at conserving different aspects of the environment and the plants and the animals that are found there. For paleontological work on Skye, it constitutes what's called an operation requiring consent. And these are activities which would potentially damage natural features of a SSSI. So we're given that consent from Nature Scot. We have to apply each year with conditions from them that minimise our impact. But we also have to obtain permission from the landowners. And in the case of the Stratheard Peninsula, that's the John Muir Trust, and they own the mineral rights as well. So you can see on this map the boundary of their land. It's in purple and it's quite substantial. If you think back to the previous map we were just looking at, a lot of this land comes under conservation legislature in one way or another. And of course, as a conservation charity themselves, John Muir Trust are interested not only in preserving the natural heritage of the area, but actively managing it to increase biodiversity and restore landscapes. However, I do notice that fossils don't seem to be featured in their strategic plans, at least as far as I could find online. So that's something that I'd like to see addressed in the future. So when we're doing our work on Skye, we're charged with carrying out extraction in a way that's sensitive to the environment and landscape. So the main ways that our team in Stratheard minimise our impact is that we time our work so it doesn't interfere with the eagle breeding season. And luckily, that coincides with the time when there's no midges, so it's a win-win. We are also incredibly selective about what rocks we remove from the shoreline. There are actually lots of little pieces of fossils scattered through the rocks, so we remove those that as a team we all think hold the greatest scientific potential, so that we're not over-harvesting, as it were. And another stipulation of our permit is that whatever we do collect gets accessioned into the National Museum Scotland. That way it's kept for the public and for other researchers to access. We also do what we call dressing the extraction sites to make them less obvious, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. And the final one is impact monitoring, and that's actually not a stipulation of our permission to work there, but it's something that I've been independently working on at our site in Stratheard. Now, in terms of those last 2 points, I'm particularly keen to measure the impact of our extraction on the area. And that's not just the extraction by us, but by geologists and paleontologists since the 1970s. So to give you an example of that, here's a boulder from the shoreline. And you can see that there are 2 rock cuts in it that we know were made between the 1990s to the early 2000s. And we can't be 100% sure who made them or exactly when, but it was definitely before our team started work there. And as you can see, they do provide excellent habitats for marine life. They're filled with limpets and periwinkles, but they are quite unsightly and obvious, and that's not what we want to see on this coastline. So with our work, we aim to leave cuts more like this. This has been dressed, as I mentioned earlier. So that means we knock off the edges and leave this much more rugged surface. So it's similar to what you'd see if there had been a rock fall, for example. Now the fresh cut, as I took this photograph straight after it was done, it looks pretty obvious at the moment because when you do this, you see the natural colour of the rock underneath, which is this stunning pigeon blue limestone. But when you compare it to older rock cuts like this one, so this one was also made in the 1990s to the early 2000s, you can see that once the surface weathers and is colonised by barnacles and limpets, the cuts are almost invisible. Now you might be asking yourself whether we should be collecting these fossils at all. Perhaps we should be leaving them in situ. Well, of course, as I've previously mentioned, due to the coastal location of the sites, if we left those fossils in place, they would just be lost. They would not be able to be appreciated either because they would be eroded out of the rock. So that's one of the reasons, of course, to remove them, but also this rock is extremely difficult to work with. It's very hard and brittle. It's quite unusual in that regard. So this means that if we were to leave fossils in place and amateur collectors were to attempt to remove them, they would almost certainly not be successful. And they would shatter the fossils and lose them, as well as, of course, making an unsightly amount of damage on the site. Now, thankfully, our fossils aren't actually all that attractive to just look at as they are, which makes amateur collecting kind of unappealing anyway. They can really only be studied using cutting-edge methods, such as X-ray CT and synchrotron scanning. And these fossils provide important scientific information about the evolution of many key modern groups, including mammals, but also salamanders and lizards. And extracting them is not only important for science, but it's a crucial means of disseminating knowledge and experience more widely through the resulting research. And by depositing them in museums, they're of course accessible for everyone in posterity. And of course that encourages a more general interest in geology and paleontology, which I think is always good. Now, I've been talking about a very specific site, and I'd like to now touch on geoconservation more generally. So I've told you the ways in which we actively manage our locality, but that's far from the whole picture about conservation at sites in general. And what's more, it doesn't really deal with how this site fits into the local community and their needs and the growth in geotourism. In their 2008 paper on geodiversity, Gray discusses a provisional classification of geoconservation methods that could be used to conserve elements of geodiversity. Now, geodiversity, I should add here, is just the same really as biodiversity, but with rocks and minerals. So what struck me looking at this table, and why I've plucked it out particularly, is the methods for geoconservation, secrecy and signage. They sit right above one another. And it intrigues me because it reflects one of the big dilemmas faced by those who steward sites that have rare fossil material, such as those on Skye. Do we keep quiet about them so that people don't know about them and can't find them? And who should know about these sites, and how much should they know? As a scientist, we have to consider this in the context of the work we publish. How accurately should we be marking the location of our fossils? Is it appropriate also to talk to the press about the discoveries? Or do we signpost the fossils? Do we make a pointed effort to let people know how valuable they are to science, and then hopefully that we can dissuade anyone from damaging them? Well, concern over making the location of fossil finds known to the wider public, I think, is well-founded. There are numerous cases of damage at fossil localities, sometimes through purposeful attempts to remove fossils, more often through misguided enthusiasm. And this conversation, it comes up time and again among stakeholders on Skye, and of course at other sites around the world, and opinions do vary based on individual circumstances and outlooks. So another example is the Northwest Highlands Geopark. I'm collaborating on a project looking at the fossils there. And before I go on, I'd like to take a moment just to say that if you would like to know more about those fossils, there is a great talk tonight by my colleague, Dr. Frankie Dunn, about them, and you can find more booking details on the Northwest Highlands Geopark website. So some of the people we've spoken to locally in the geopark, they're concerned that these rare fossils that are found within the park's boundary could be collected if they're publicly known about. Now, my colleagues thought this was highly unlikely because the location is too remote to be accessible. However, I might argue that fossils being less accessible could make them more vulnerable to unscrupulous collection. So in populated areas such as the English South Coast, as you see here, there's always other people around. So restrictions on collections and guidelines about responsible behaviour, they can actually be enforced by other members of the public. At sites that are less densely populated or visited, that sort of public enforcement is less likely to happen, and a collector might be able to cause significant damage without being discovered. This is also, it highlights part of the reason for the differing outlook that people have with regards to the threat that fossil poaching places on remote Scottish localities, as has been discussed by other speakers at UHI's The Edge series of talks, and also, as I've mentioned already in this talk, the idea of remoteness itself is quite subjective. If you're used to scenes like this on the beach, your perception of remoteness will be quite different to those who are living and working in the Hebrides and Northwest Highlands. So for people living in these areas, fossils are part of their near, not their remote. There's therefore a considerable gap between stakeholders, a gap that exists not only in discussions about geoconservation, but also land management and wider land use issues in general. And similar issues to this are explored in UHI's Pioneering Land Use Conference. So the perception by local stakeholders of the risks that fossils face when they're in situ doesn't always match the perception from those from other parts of the UK and beyond. And that presents a challenge for us when we're trying to formulate geoconservation approaches. And placing notice boards is recommended as one of the main ways to help deter collecting and of course promote responsible collecting. And I think Achanaris Quarry, which is in Caithness, is an excellent example. So here the interpretation board, as well as giving really good information about the fossils and the background geologically, it also includes the Scottish Fossil Code. So this encourages visitors to employ best practice when they're looking for fossils. But as I said, signage does work better when transgressors could be seen by other people. So therefore there is a concern that if we erected signs on Skye, for example, it's more likely to alert passers-by to the presence of the fossils that they weren't previously aware of and increase their visibility and in turn the risk of their illegal collection. It's well known that collectors do use scientific literature to pinpoint locations and obtain fossils for market. And it's a common practice for scientific researchers therefore not to advertise their discoveries until the work is completed. And even then, they often don't make the exact location publicly known. Scientific papers are also seldom accessible to the wider public, and those that are often filled with scientific lingo that makes them very hard to interpret outside academia. Now, with the best of intentions, this creates a kind of hidden knowledge about fossil localities, and it privileges that information among a few academic gatekeepers. I am often intrigued at the lengths to which researchers will actually take this secrecy, even or perhaps especially among their colleagues. And it can also lead to this amusing scenario that I've witnessed a few times where researchers will circumlocute the location when they're talking to the local community about the fossils that they're studying, only to discover that naturally the local people already know all about it. It's really easy to forget that those who live locally are actually the best of all stewards, and they should be considered active co-conservators of their heritage. But secrecy can of course also lead to the circumstance where local communities are left in the dark about their local geological heritage because they have no access to the information that's being gathered by visiting researchers. Now, this lack of with local communities raises lots of issues. Geotourism provides tourist income for local communities, and Skye has long been a geotourism pilgrimage site. More recently, of course, the building of the Skye Bridge made the island more accessible from the mainland, and the fossils, especially the footprints, are part of what draws tourists to the area. So we hear constantly in the press reports about new discoveries on Skye that are internationally significant. But in a recent paper on geotourism, Frey points out that international geological significance alone will not, so therefore not contribute to the sustainable development of the area in the medium to long term. It needs to be interconnected with other heritage areas in the territory, including intangible heritage. Now, Frey goes on to outline that geotourism can be recognised by multiple activities taking place, both in a formal corporate infrastructure and on local, more ad hoc bases. And I'm not going to read through all of these, don't worry, but we can highlight a few that are of key interest to us in this talk. Now, there are activities taking place on Skye that I think fit into almost all of these indicators, but most of the activities are not part of a formal corporate structure. They've tended to evolve more organically, often around particular people who are passionate stewards of the geological heritage of Skye. I think a fantastic example of this is Dougal Ross with his Staff and Dinosaur Museum on the Trotternish Peninsula. He really is one of the key stakeholders on the island. He's local to Skye and he built this museum himself, and he's been working as an amateur professional paleontologist there for most of his life, as well as being involved in archaeology, cultural heritage, and as a native Gaelic speaker, language heritage and preservation as well. His museum contains fossils, but it also has other items of cultural heritage, and it's provided this really crucial focal point for the work of professional paleontologists as well as policymakers and other stakeholders. Now, Ross's efforts are, I think, a perfect example of what can be achieved when local stakeholders are actively involved in research and geoconservation and geotourism. Another good example of geotourism taking place on Skye is the recently completed Staff and Eco Museum. So this is a joined up project that brings different heritages together. And it's not a building, it's a network of 13 sites outdoors which tell stories of local heritage, and each site has an information point, such as this one, and they're linked by road and rail and walking trails down the eastern coast of the Trotternish Peninsula. They also link up with local businesses and tours, and they have the backing of sponsors at local, national and international level. So I think the Eco Museum meets a lot of the targets identified as the prerequisites of geotourism. And I really, I look forward to seeing what the outcomes of this project are over the long term. So I'd like now to begin to draw this talk to a close and kind of reflect on the next steps. I've not been able to cover even half of the things that we could talk about. This subject is quite huge, but I hope I've touched on some of the issues connected with sustainable development of geotourism on Skye and beyond, and also the history and challenges of geoconservation. And I think there are some projects being developed which will play key roles as our economy recovers from the impact of COVID-19. So, for example, looking more broadly, I recently took part in consultations for SciTour, which is an exciting new initiative to develop and promote scientific tourism. And that basically is tourism that puts scientific learning at the heart of the tourist experience. And it's being developed by partners from Arctic and peri-Arctic countries, including stakeholders from Finland and Iceland and Greenland and the Scottish Highlands and Islands. In fact, UHI is involved in this as well. Now, they focus on localities that have recently become more accessible to tourists, although perhaps not in the last year. So they're seeing an increase in visitor numbers, but they have a low economic diversity overall and less access to major markets. And these places, of course, are also usually experiencing an outmigration from their local communities. So the SciTour project is aiming to help small businesses and startups to develop and market new scientific tourism products, including, of course, geotourism initiatives. So I think this is really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing how this progresses. And I think projects like that can inform our new geotourism developments on Skye. So for researchers like myself, we need to find ways to balance geoconservation with economic development in rural areas. And although some degree of secretiveness is necessary to protect some sites, the rise of media coverage and social media means, and the general interest in geology sites in general from the wider public, means that secrecy is not a long-term geoconservation strategy or one compatible with sustainable development. So by looking at good practice around the world, we should be able to find constructive ways to co-curate all kinds of heritage while still conserving it. So one of the ways that I recently tried to encourage such co-curation in the next generation was through the Scottish Fossil Workshops programme, which I developed, and visited rural Scottish schools for free, and particularly those in usually sort of overlooked areas where other outreach programmes don't tend to visit. Now, these workshops were designed to fit into the curriculum for excellence, while also teaching primary school age children about geology, fossils and conservation, but using their local heritage as a starting point and exploring the subject through an interactive talk and fossil handling and games. So the idea really ultimately was to help foster this next generation of geoheritage stewards. So I think as a discipline, paleontology is a liminal science, which is why it fits in so well with this series of interdisciplinary talks, The Edge. And it's unusually interdisciplinary among the sciences because it incorporates anatomy, ecology, geology, statistics, coding, chemistry, genetics, phylogeny, much, much more. But it's not only a discipline that spans all these scientific boundaries, but it also seeps over into the edges of tourism, literature, media, heritage, museum studies and conservation. And it appeals to all ages and all socioeconomic backgrounds. More than this, it expands through time, existing very much in the present by incorporating the latest technologies alongside the traditional tried and tested practices of looking and observation. And it uses them to see in deep time and build a picture of the past on the macro and the micro scale. The entire occupation of paleontology is a practice of seeing to understand the past and using the present to inform that understanding and using the past to inform the present and, of course, the future. So thank you very much for listening to my ramble, to my talk. I would love to hear your questions and your input on this subject.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for my video to come on. I'm having a slight problem there. Thank you very much for such a fascinating talk. It's yeah, really excellent. So many questions. I have a couple, but I can see that somebody has come in. So this is Frank Rennie has asked, a wonderfully thought and well-delivered talk, thanks. Can you say something more about what we might do in general about fossils threatened by coastal erosion?
Fossils threatened by coastal erosion. Well, again, I mean, as I touched on in the talk, this is something that does divide people a little bit. I mean, there are some people who would advocate collecting everything that could be, of course, eroded away. I guess it really is site specific, isn't it? I mean, in terms of our site, we certainly aim to collect everything that's of the highest scientific value. But we certainly wouldn't think it would be practical to suggest collecting absolutely everything. Particularly, I mean, the stuff that we're also collecting is quite rare. So, you know, you'll only rarely find the really, really good stuff, as it were, although you get lots of flecks of not very good, not very important things. But you've got sites, of course, that have fossils, but there are millions of them. So the Jurassic coast is a really good example in England. I mean, the sites where they allow the public to come and collect, part of the reason they do that is because there's no way you could possibly collect all the stuff that's coming out of those shores. I mean, there are millions of ammonites in those rocks. So yeah, I think it's a case-by-case basis as to what to do about it. That table I showed you had some other sorts of examples, some of them more practical than others. And I think on the coast, one of the ones actually that amused me a lot, and I was going to pick it out as a kind of laughing point, was the employing reburial as an option, which I thought was quite an amusing idea when you're talking about, of course, whole landscapes of the coast, and when you couldn't possibly obviously do anything like that. So it's definitely a case-by-case basis. It's difficult to say.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I see lots of parallels with archaeology. It's quite interesting. You know, a few questions that could be asked relating to that, but I'll go to other people's questions. So we've got one here. So I think this is from Jason Gilchrist. In biodiversity conservation, there's local engagement. So this is just a statement actually on the question. Other examples of colonial type exclusion, parallels to left. Saying very thank you for you've made there, I think. So somebody up, Elsa, do you have plans for further fossil workshops? Fossil workshops, or do you have resources that you can share? So that, I think, is from Alison Wright.
I would very much like to continue doing the fossil workshops, and also it'd be great to have maybe volunteers, so that there could be more than just, because it was myself and my partner actually went and delivered them, and as anybody who does these kinds of things will know, it's really intense. Talking to kids all day, they're intense. So it would be wonderful to be able to expand that and have like multiple people who could deliver it and take it to different places that I wasn't able to reach. At the moment, I don't have any extra resources placed online, but certainly if people are interested in finding out what I did and getting that information, I would be delighted to share it with other people and have other people to do that as well. Yeah. Oh, I should also say, if you look on YouTube, I do have a video which gives more information about what I did. If you just Google it, Scottish Fossil Workshops, you should be able to find it.
Okay, thank you. So somebody's asked, can we hear more about John Muir of the Trust in National Parks? I'm not entirely sure what that question. Raggy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know that much about John Muir in general. I couldn't really answer that question.
That's fine. I have a question relating to the coastal erosion one, and you mentioned that there's some areas there's lots of fossils that are kind of a low grade value and in terms of uniqueness. Do these exist in Scotland as well? And would you be able to use that as a kind of opportunity for community projects, you know, where you actually engage the community in extraction? Or is Scotland's resources slightly different?
Yeah, they definitely do exist, and there are localities like I mentioned where people can go and collect, and part of the reason they do that is because you know that there's no reason that people wouldn't, if you know what I mean. They ask, the Scottish Fossil Code is basically, it is site dependent, but generally speaking, that you at sites like that, if you find something that seems significant, so in other words, if there are thousands of ammonites and you find another ammonite, that's fine. But if you found something that is unlike anything else you see on the shore, that in that instance you would be asked to please contact you know, Nature Scot or local paleontologists to tell them about it and report it. So quite often you'll find sites that have that, that's their kind of structure. And there are several like that, and local community quite often already know all about that, and they'll take people down there, or people will come to visit from elsewhere to look for fossils. There's a really well-known one just north of Inverness, actually, in Ethe, where you can get lots of ammonites. Yeah, so it can definitely be used as a great way to, and particularly for kids, to get them involved in geology and paleontology, but at the same time to explain to them why it's okay to collect these ones, whereas obviously somewhere else, if they found something like a whole dinosaur skeleton, to please not touch that. Not that I think they're going to, but you know, to please not touch that and to report it to someone.
So yeah, so potential to build that kind of things into the geotourism much more widely than has been done.
I think so. I think it happens more often, perhaps. There's certain localities where it does already happen, but there's certainly more potential to do that kind of thing. And there are people now on Skye, I know, who are taking people on tours of the footprints, for example, which, as they've become better known, there's been enough people interested that you can actually set that up as a tour to do. But I would actually be interested to ask you a question then, in terms of you mentioned the sort of parallels between the paleontology, erosion on coastal sites and archaeology. What would the archaeological approach be then if there was a site like that being eroded?
We're involved in work in this area where we're kind of seeing it as a potential for scientific understanding of the deposits that are being eroded, because they are being eroded out, and we're often targeting these types of deposits because they're there. We won't be destroying ones inland by targeting these, and we're also using them as a vehicle for raising awareness of climate change and coastal erosion and the impact of climate change on heritage more generally. So it's a kind of vehicle. It's, you know, a vehicle for climate action, actually, is how we would see that.
That's an
And
interesting.
that's why I was quite interested in what you were doing there, that it's quite similar in a way. You can raise people's understanding of how the climate is being affected by global climate warming and how sea level rise is increasing and all that kind of thing, and have it as part of your scientific endeavour.
Because I think also,
I think.
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I think because I think also sometimes people obviously care so passionately about the heritage that's on their own doorstep, and they can be quite frustrated when, you know, if there's a coastal site that's being damaged, and there's this kind of feeling of we should do something about that and protect it. But I mean, obviously, it can be incredibly costly and maybe not good for the sort of local broader ecological picture to try and do something like building seawalls or things like that, which of course are technically you might be able to protect a site like that, but usually those things are not practical. You know, trying to actually change the way that erosion occurs in a landscape is a huge intervention. It's really, yeah, generally not practical, is it?
No, and especially if you think about the fact that in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years, some of these sites, we just can't save them all. Therefore, there are sites that will be lost, and it's kind of recognizing that that loss is happening. We can't save everything, therefore we can work with that process.
Yeah.
In terms of project planning and at the same time raising awareness of climate change.
Yeah, definitely. And
Yeah.
and the fact that these things go to museums, of course, is always great because all museums can be accessed. I think a lot of people feel that that things are being locked away in a museum, and it's unfortunate that people feel like that because actually they may not realise that you could actually approach any museum and say, "I've heard you've got this, this particular thing. I want to see it." And however much it might irk some curators, it is actually their job to let people go and see these things. It's their job to give the public access as well as researchers. So these things are not actually locked away. So if anybody who's seen this talk today thinks, I really want to see, the fossils from Skye or the archaeological things that have been collected, technically, you can just email the museum and say, when could I come and see these things? Obviously not right now with coronavirus, but hopefully in the future.
Yes, thank you. So many things we could keep talking about, but I'm aware it's just past 2 o'clock. So and people are starting to go into other things. So I think we'll just say thank you very, very much for that fascinating talk, and we'll close the meeting with a clap. I know that we can't all hear you, but we will have clap hands. And thank you very much again. And just before we go, I just want to let everyone know that there'll be another talk from the EDGE seminar series on the 25th of March, and that will be on Belfast's maritime heritage. So thank you again, Elsa.